Welcome to the transport seminar organized by McGill. It is really nice to introduce Chris. I've known Chris for a long time. He started, we were together at school at some point in our lives, the two of us, and but I kept track of him. He started his, we did his bachelor's at Portland State. He got a master's from MIT in transportation, and then he moved to San Francisco to work there in transit planning and operations, and then moved to the DOT in Washington D.C., and then moved back to San Francisco to work there, and then moved to New York City again to work there, and worked at the transit center, and then finally he's back again at Uber in San Francisco. So it's a pleasure to have you, Chris, today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you all for joining today. Really appreciate you having me here. And when I hear you talk about my history, I realize how many cross-country moves I've made. It's a lot. If you want to make those many moves in your career, don't own much. It makes moving a lot easier. But I'm here today to talk about some of my work I did when I was in New York City and some of the work I'm doing now here in San Francisco around bringing accessibility for all to public transportation as well as new mobility. And I'll talk about this in the context of people with disabilities as well as equity issues from a geography standpoint. And there's a lot, of course, to the word equity and how you define it. And so I'll talk about one aspect of that today, and then there's many more. So I look forward to discussions and questions around that. Here's the outline of my talk today. We'll start off with the context of accessibility and mobility, and then we'll focus mostly on the campaign for accessibility in New York, and then go into new mobility and how it affects our new mobility and on-demand system today. So first, a little bit about me. So I use a wheelchair. I was born with cerebral palsy, and of course, it influences my life, but it really has influenced a lot of my thinking in transportation as well. I went to school for civil engineering, which is where Ahmed and I were at school together at Portland State, and focusing now on transit policy and planning. And of course, I've been a disability transportation advocate as well. Although the funny thing with that is you kind of don't choose to be one, you just kind of become one because you're trying to get around cities and trying to get around places. But I've since embraced that role in my career and personal life. And so let's talk a little bit about the historical context of accessibility and why this is such an important issue in the world of mobility. When you think about transportation, and here's a picture of New York here, especially in a city like New York and like Montreal as well, public transportation is like the lifeblood of the city. It's the way that you're able to experience the city, to get around. It's affordable in New York, $2.75 a ride. Compare that to like a $30 Uber or a $30 taxi ride. But the problem is it's not accessible for everybody. It was built in the 1900s up until adding new lines until today. Here's a map from 1980s on the right, and the biggest thing you'll notice is the lack of any wheelchair symbols on this map because none of the stations were accessible until recently. And so if you needed something besides stair access, you're out of luck. 8 million people in that city. You can imagine how many people were out of luck getting around. And so the buses also weren't exempt from this. And so for the longest time in the United States, we really have this system with stairs and no ramps on buses and no lifts. And we get to this point where this organization called ADAPT in the 1960s and 70s started demanding accessible transportation. And when those demands were not met and actually actively resisted by the public transportation industry, they took to the streets like any good protest. And in this case here, these pictures are from Denver, where disability advocates were blocking RTD buses because they didn't have any ramps or lifts. And this was during an American Public Transportation Association conference. APTA, of course, now is a huge friend of the accessibility movement. They're great. But its leadership back in the 70s and 80s was not. And this has inspired a lot of these protests. Thanks to these protests, though, 100% of the bus fleet, almost 100% of the bus fleet in the United States is accessible now for people with disabilities. I'm going to take us back to New York, though, for a little bit and talk about the subway system there. And the reason why I want to talk about the subway in New York is it's really a microcosm of the entire public transportation system, let's say globally. It really represents that a system in a city in which people depend on transit to get around. And if you restrict access to that system to a certain population, you are thereby denying that population access to economic and social opportunity that everybody else has. And that includes education, it includes jobs, it includes independence, housing, you name it. Just think about your normal commute, and that's essentially restricted if you can't use the subway or a bus in New York City. So let's rewind back to 1984 when people were demanding essentially access to the subway. And you had Mayor Koch from New York who essentially blocked this. And if you see the lower left corner, you'll see the quote where he says, "I have concluded it's simply wrong to spend $50 million in the next 8 years and ultimately more in putting elevators in the subway." On the right is another article talking about the mayor who thinks that by building elevators, it's going to cost $2,000 a ride, essentially, for people, and it's a big waste of money. After a lot of fighting back and forth, they eventually approved 50 elevators, but it was only a 9-4 vote, so there were 4 people still dissenting that didn't want to build elevators in New York City Transit. And this is only for 50 of them. There's 472 stations in New York, and this is for 50 elevators. And instead, what they wanted to do was, instead of spending $50 million in 84, they wanted to build a paratransit system instead, parallel transit system, in which people with disabilities could use designated vehicles with lifts in order to transport them around the city instead of using the subway. And we'll get to that in a second. So what happened, though, in 1990 is then George H.W. Bush ended up signing the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed by Congress after decades of advocacy from the disability community, which essentially mandated that public accommodations, including public transportation, had to be accessible. Now, the problem with the approach in New York was that there was a lot of resistance, and so the ADA eventually mandated through lawsuits and settlements that 100 elevators be built by 2020, which is this year, and that a paratransit system be set up. So let's talk about that in the next 30 years, 1990 until today, and the importance of all the work that happened in New York. So paratransit, again, this is this parallel van system, which you can see in the upper right corner, which picks up and drops off people with disabilities. There's a lot wrong with this, which we'll get to later, but generally speaking, this is the system. And if you look at the left, the graph, you can see the costs. So the blue is the annual cost, and the orange line is the total number of trips per year, and since 1990. And you can see that now about 6.5, 7 million trips are happening every year on paratransit, and the annual cost is approaching $500 million every single year. Let's remember what the mayor said back in 84. I don't want to spend $50 million on elevators. Instead, we're spending $500 million annually now because of the lack of elevators in New York City. Had New York gone and built elevators and done other things necessary to get the subway accessible, paratransit would be a minuscule amount of ridership. Instead, it's ballooned into this huge thing costing 10x the elevator budget every year. So obviously a disaster financially for the system, and it's a disaster for people with disabilities because paratransit, frankly, is terrible service compared to the subway. And so what this ended up showing is that 28 years after the ADA, back in 2018, now it's 30, of course, it's still very bad. And so I was living in New York from 2014 until this last year, and I experienced probably 3 elevator outages every week, which means like a trip that I intended to take could not be taken. And so I ended up documenting all this because it was just a problem. And when I got to Transit Center, I was able to start a campaign to fix this, to bring this to the public light. Um, and so what we ended up seeing here, and this is from the Transit Center report, is that the number of elevators in the system, the subway system, 23% of stations have elevator access. But the problem is the availability of the elevators, the uptime is only 95%. And this, by the way, let me take a side trip here for a second. 95% sounds great. I'm sure if Ahmed gave you a 95% on a test, you would be happy. I would be happy if I got 95% from him. But the problem is that when you're talking about elevator uptime, 95% is terrible. You have to think of it more like a temperature of the body. Like 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is great. 97 degrees, you're probably dead. And so it makes a difference on the scale there. And so really what you want on elevator uptime is about 99%. And the problem is with 95%, you're getting 90 elevators out per year. Like one person can encounter that many outages. And I did personally, I have that documented. And so the problem is that even if there are elevators, they're not useful. Oops. And so in the system, of all the hundred or so elevators in the system, about a quarter of them have outages throughout the system on a daily basis. And at the current rate of building elevators, they won't be accessible until the year 2090, which of course would be 100 years after the ADA. So a lot of unacceptable situation there in New York. So this is a picture of Penn Station 5 years ago. Penn Station, if you don't know, is the busiest train station in New York, in the United States, I believe North America too. And this is the subway, the state of the subway if you need an elevator in supposedly the greatest city in the world. Here's a couple more pictures from a year ago during the APTA conference, actually, that I was attending. And this is just a common sight, unfortunately, in New York. So if you look at the systems that are accessible, again, we said 23% is accessible. What does that look like on a map? Well, on the left are the number of the subway stops throughout the city. If you're familiar with the city, you can see you can get around Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn pretty easily if stairs are okay. But on the right, you can see that huge swaths of New York are off limits. Essentially, this part of Brooklyn here on the west side, the southwest side of Brooklyn, much of the Bronx, unless you happen to live next to one of these rare subway stops. Much of uptown Manhattan is off limits, and much of Queens. And it means you can only go to certain parts of the city reliably. There are no cross-borough buses, essentially. But if you think about it, like from a housing point of view, all the relatively affordable housing is in these gaps. And so if you're someone who makes a median wage or even like 80th percentile wage in New York, you probably can't live there, given if you need a subway that's accessible, given that most of the housing that's accessible is in this area, which of course is extremely expensive. So there's a lot of knockoff effects because of this situation. And so I was very proud to be part of the Transit Center and that they enabled us to start a campaign to demand a change here. And I think this is a big lesson here is that I learned as a young idealist that I thought the system would just work, is that you actually have to push the system to work, that things will not just change because you want them to change. You actually have to go out there and make a difference. And that one person actually can make a difference. And that we organized, so this is my colleague Mel here. She's actually the one that organized all this stuff. She was great. This is City Councilor Adonis Rodriguez, who was the transportation chair in New York City, speaking at our thing. And we're in front of the New York City subway headquarters. This is 2 Broadway, headquarters of New York City Transit. And here we are speaking to the media that, hey, we need more elevators and this is terrible. This is Scott Stringer back here in the tie. He's running for mayor right now in New York. And so a lot of great politicians actually came out to get behind us, which was fantastic. They actually cared about the issue, which was great. And we continued this push since 2017. We also widened our base of support to include the I forgot what AARP, American Association of Retired People, I think it stands for, generally older adults, to also get back behind our work here, as well as parents who push their kids in strollers or have to carry their children. The elevators have a wide, constituency. And so by expanding the constituency, we were able to get more folks involved in calling for more elevators throughout New York City. And the media picked it up, which is fantastic. Emily Nonko, who is a great reporter in New York, ended up writing about this in Curbed to bring attention to the issue. Vice followed around Andy Byford, who I think we stole from Toronto. Yes, he came from Toronto to New York to lead the New York City subway system. He's now at TfL in London, but he took an interest in the issue and listened to people with disabilities about the situation, and actually ended up making a commitment that we would get New York City Transit fully accessible by the year 2035, and that by the year 2025 we would have 50 more elevators in addition to the current 100. So there was progress here, which was great. The advocacy was working. And you ended up happening, this was a huge victory, that we had $5 billion allocated for subway elevators, which is way more than we ever had before. And so this was a huge victory for people who needed elevators. So going forward, the fight for inclusion continues in New York City. And this is even more so now with COVID. I didn't even mention COVID yet, but you can imagine COVID is going to be slashing budgets left and right in cities all across the world. New York State is going to be, New York City is going to be short $5 billion next year. That happens to be $5 billion matching what we had allocated for the elevators. There's also, the state will be short even more. And clearly there are a lot of priorities here that the cities and states have to deal with besides elevators. It's school funding, roadway maintenance, you name it, healthcare. Our unemployment's at 10%. So we've got a lot of headwinds ahead of us here in order to get these elevators and funding allocated. But it's important because it's, again, a primary means of transportation, a primary means of freedom, if you will. And it's 1/3 of our ridership here in the United States. And so I suspect that over the next 20 years, there's going to be a lot of legal and advocacy and internal back channels that's going to happen. That's going to be necessary. And I know, for me at least, I can't, this is going to be with me for the rest of my life. I will not stop working for an accessible New York City transit because I know a lot of my colleagues who are in this photo when I was in New York won't either. And this is the crew that you see in that photo, plus me and a few others. Like, there's like 20 of us that are pushing for this and making a lot of noise. And so it requires a lot of energy to make happen. But I think we can do this. We have a great group of people, thankfully a very receptive population and a receptive politicians to keep pushing this forward. So I do want to talk a little bit about Montreal as well. I visited Montreal, great place, 3 years ago, and it's a difficult place to say the least about subway accessibility. It's comparable to New York in terms of the lower number of accessible subway elevators, and just as a comparison between Montreal and New York, Montreal and Toronto. Toronto's on the left, Montreal's on the right in this table. Interestingly enough, there's less capacity on buses for people with wheelchairs on Montreal versus Toronto. The third one here, about half the stations are accessible in Toronto versus like less than 20% in Montreal. And then by 2025, again, COVID probably will affect this timeline here, but the TTC estimates that all stations will be accessible versus only 40% accessible in Montreal by 2024. And so I think this is an interesting contrast in approach to accessibility, and probably has to do a little bit with culture, a little bit with advocacy, and how the age of the system plays a role. I believe Montreal's a little bit older than Toronto. And so I think that New York is not the only problem, obviously. Paris, London, Montreal, Toronto, Chicago, all have these older rail systems which give access to their city for people with disabilities, but only out a few places. And expanding it can be huge. And I think if it's hard to internalize what this means, One of the best ways to do it is just imagine your neighborhood right now where you live, and if you live further away from a subway stop, or there's a place that you want to go that's far away from a subway stop. Imagine a subway stop being built right where you want it. That's kind of the impact of an elevator opening up all of a sudden at an existing station. And so let me pivot a little bit to Uber and my work here and mobility on demand. And then I'm going to tie it back all together at the end of how accessibility and Uber kind of work together and transit. And so just a quick brief, Uber, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is kind of an on-demand platform for rides in which you have drivers on one end and riders on the other using the app to find each other. And we have a certain number of cities with wheelchair accessible vehicles, waves, on them. Um, and this allows for a very low wait time. This is a chart of San Francisco showing wait times in the city, all very much under 3 to 5 minutes throughout most of the city. Taxi system would be a lot different, obviously. So this has really revolutionized that from that point of view. And what this has done is it's allowed people who did not have good taxi service to begin with much better on-demand service. So this is a different kind of equity. This is more of a geographical equity. And you can see on the right that outer borough pickups, so this is New York City, non-Manhattan pickups, huge. Uber is like what, I think 20 or 8 to 4x of taxi pickups in the outer boroughs, and taxi just never really went out there. So it's a huge change where if you live in the outer boroughs, all of a sudden your access. And this is a map here. There's a lot going on here, but the point is, if you look at the map, the purple area is where a greater share of Uber pickups versus average. And so you can see again, Uber is picking up a lot more in the outer areas of the city versus the central side, which is already served well by taxis. And this goes to show, like, if you live in these outer areas, generally speaking, you're probably making less money than you are if you live in Manhattan. And so it kind of highlights a different kind of accessibility for people who are lower income, people who live in the outer areas who didn't have this kind of transportation service before. And so this is all great and good, but if the cars are not accessible, there's still a certain population blocked out. And so what we're looking to do is bring more wheelchair accessible vehicles to the platform in order to improve access for everybody. We work with commercial wheelchair accessible vehicle providers to help onboard their fleets onto our system because a lot of people just don't own personal wheelchair accessible vehicles. And so it's really cool that in New York City, where the Taxi and Limousine Commission has a rule that you can see in June 2020, 80% of all of our wheelchair accessible vehicle trips have to be wait time of 15 minutes or less, and 90% have to be 30 minutes or less. And Uber is meeting that, which is great, and we're carrying 84% of all for-hire vehicle wheelchair accessible vehicle trips in New York, which is amazing. Like if you were to take an Uber Wave 4 years ago, it would have been terrible. Now it's like taking a regular Uber, which is really great. I mean, imagine that versus a paratransit system, which is like a 24-hour reservation. Now it's like a 15-minute reservation. So finally, we can tie this all together here. If you think about how do you marry this idea of on-demand wheelchair accessible vehicle transportation with this idea of paratransit, which is demand responsive, but takes about 24 hours to reserve a vehicle and get one. And so this is the idea that we're looking at in Boston right now, which is have this available where paratransit riders can request an Uber Wave or an X if they don't need a wheelchair accessible vehicle and get an on-demand ride, as opposed to the old way of, again, calling in advance, waiting 24 hours and having like a cable guy arrival window, plus or minus an hour to pick you up. And for Boston, they were able to save a lot of money in their operations. Per trip cost reduced from $46 to $13, which really allows the MBTA to serve more people. And it's increased the number of trips by 28%. So more people are traveling because it's, again, a lot more convenient than it was prior. And then finally, I just wanted to wrap up with looking at Uber Wave in Toronto. And so there was a study done recently looking at, with the data that we have and that we share with Toronto, like what is the wait time of Uber Wave in the city? And this is generally pretty good. Like if you look at the map, most areas are under 5 minutes, many are 5 to 9 minutes. There's some that are greater than 11, which is we need to be working on. But for the most part, it's increased accessibility in the terms of like what can you access in a city dramatically for people who need wheelchair accessible vehicles. And you can just imagine the level of freedom that brings to somebody who previously, again, had to wait a long time for a ride before. And so I'm really hopeful that this kind of service can revolutionize the way we deliver paratransit service in the world. So I will stop there. It's a lot, I know, but hopefully there's some good questions that we can go back and forth on and open up the discussion. So Ahmed, I'll turn it back over to you for Q&A. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much. Let me open my notes so we can see the questions, but I'll start with a COVID question because you didn't touch on COVID. Okay, so how do you see things now with the advocacy going and with the transit agencies responding to COVID and helping people with disabilities to reach hospital appointments, doctor appointments, things like that? Based on personal experience or based on what you hear from your advocacy circles from both sides?
So it's tough because I think we start with the bigger impact. COVID is going to cause massive budget reductions in public transportation authorities across, let's just keep it to North America for now, across North America. And that impacts all service, not just paratransit, but buses and trains as well. New York City's, floating a 40% service cut. It's huge. And so to maintain access, the best way is to have an accessible bus and train system. That's the best way for anybody. But with paratransit, which again eats up a lot of money, we're talking like $50 a ride in New York, for example, approximately. It's going to be tough. I think what transit agencies are going to be needing to do is to look at models like the Boston model, where on-demand is being used. New York's got the e-hail program, which uses taxis, as well as looking at incorporating Ubers into that system. I think we're going to have to rethink the way we deliver public transportation services in order to make sure that we're able to absorb this cost blow while maintaining some semblance of important services. The other side too is deliveries potentially. Reverse paratransit, if you will. We've always thought of public transportation agencies as a means to bring people to where they want to go. Why not bring the things they need to them instead? As a delivery service. And it's kind of weird to think of transit agencies that way. But if you think about what they do, all they're doing is connecting people to opportunity. Why not bring the opportunity to the person? And so that's a potential way to look at things as well. It's going to be tough. And I think the service cut prioritization will be how we figure this out.
How we feel it. Okay, now let me go. I'll take the questions. Jing is organizing them at a different level. So I'll go with a very higher level on the conceptualization of disability that Nicholas is asking about. In many cases, we talk about wheelchair accessibility, but we don't talk about cognitive or visual or other kinds of disability. So isn't it time to start expanding, to be more advocating for universal accessibility, to reaching out?
Absolutely. Okay. And I didn't mention it much in my presentation, but it's definitely something that is focused on not just at Uber, but also at public transportation authorities. New York City Transit in particular, I know they've taken a holistic approach, and a lot of transit agencies do this, to accessibility, not just for physical wheelchair as the biggest kind of visual example, probably the most costliest example, but for people who are blind in terms of providing guidance to people within stations, to buses, to schedules, to real-time information, cognitive disabilities in terms of making sure the system is as easy to navigate as possible and not unnecessarily complicated. But I think your point is right, though, in that these issues still don't get the attention they deserve. And I think while some systems, I think San Francisco MTA, where I used to work, for example, does a great job of at least looking at the issues and incorporating them in the development of their systems and engineering and planning. Not everybody does that, and that is something that needs to change. And I think that's something we need more uh, guidance and information from. You know, you just can't make a law and expect people to know how to follow it all of a sudden. There needs to be much more hand-holding and push for those kinds of those changes.
In Montreal here, the higher, like the paratransit itself is a small percentage that uses the regular paratransit. And in many cases, they hire taxis in Montreal for paratransit. To replace a paratransit trip, the transit agencies, and in Toronto, it's a big percentage that is being just allocated the money towards private entities to provide for paratransit. I know you work for Uber, but I want to know from your advocacy standpoint, what do you think about this idea of public versus private approach in providing paratransit?
Yeah, I think that
Moving into an efficient way, or what's your thoughts?
I think it has to be. I think there has to be both. Both need to be involved in this. I think what makes public transportation in general interesting is that you have, and this is a lot of issues here, which we can it's open up a lot of questions, I'm sure. But like, if you look at someone driving a train, one or two people operate that train, and you pick up and drop off thousands of people per hour, especially in New York and Montreal, I'm sure. On paratransit, it's the same number of people. It's one person, and they're only picking up and dropping off maybe two people per hour. And so it's a huge cost burden that has to be spread out among those two people on paratransit. Or, of course, what happens is it's a large subsidy. And so we need to figure out the best way that we can spend very limited public resources to get them the most transportation. And this is a values question. It's not something that I or anybody here, I think, can answer for a certain community. I would be mistaken to answer for the city of Montreal or how they best would want to approach this. But if you're trying to optimize for as much transportation as you can provide for the limited amount of public dollars that you have, then I think working with a taxi or an Uber or some kind of private provider is a must. You have to be able to uh, reduce costs as much as possible and provide a much better service at the same time. And what I mean by that is if you think about Uber service and as an example, or taxis even, is that the transit agency or the rider only pays for the time that they're in that vehicle and on their way to somewhere. And that kind of system allows the agency to share the cost among multiple riders, or not just the riders in the system, but also people who don't use paratransit that are using that vehicle on the outside. And I think that allows them to keep the cost lower. When you have a dedicated fleet with dedicated staff, that will make your costs a lot higher, and by therefore you'll have less service that you can provide by definition. And so it's a balancing act. Do you want that dedicated fleet and dedicated staff, or are you okay with paying per trip?
Uh, I still remember your trip to Montreal a couple of years ago, and I want you you came to Montreal and you experienced it in person, and then you experienced many cities in the U.S. How much do you think is like the federal policies impacting what's happening in Canada compared to the US? Is it like the federal policy that's really making sure that things are moving forward in the US, or it's mostly coming from local and advocacy on the ground?
We needed the federal policy here to start it. That was for sure. Um, so the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, was absolutely necessary in order to get the rest of the industry on board. One of the things you can see is that like if only San Francisco was advocating, or Berkeley, where the kind of the birthplace of a lot of the disability movement, was advocating for accessible buses, if you're a bus manufacturer, you have very little pressure to serve just one community when all the other buses, sorry, when all the other communities don't need accessible buses. But when the federal government of the United States is saying, nope, you have to have accessible buses now, it forces the OEMs, the bus manufacturers, and others to turn this over and make it work. And I think in Canada's case, I'm not as familiar with the federal law there, but like
Okay.
if you need a you kind of need a push, a place to appeal to. Like, let me just give another example here. In New York, with our advocacy there, without the ADA and without the state and city laws that govern accessibility that came because of the ADA, there's no one to turn to. If I were to say, hey, New York City Transit's not building elevators, guys, who am I talking to without a federal law? Who's going to be the one that actually enforces my inquiry? And you need someone to turn to. It can't just be like an internal investigation. It needs to be an outside body that enforces this.
Um, Another question that came about paratransit, and this is it always comes, is like like did paratransit in its initial stages serve as a possible solution, or it did pose more problems of segregation? Of you're putting people on wheelchairs on their own, and now they are not part of the full system. I know you're calling for advocacy for everybody to be using the same thing by the work in New York, but I'm talking about the early stages when they started bringing that as a solution. Did it lead to more segregation? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so paratransit was definitely in my opinion, it should have been an interim solution before getting everybody on the same system. I think that's what it's meant to be. The problem, though, I think with paratransit is that it it although it helps solve a near-term problem, it can act like a long-term problem and help the agency not get to the rest of the system, as we're seeing in New York, and not just New York. I keep picking on them, but Chicago, Boston, Toronto, Montreal, Paris, London. All these cities are still nowhere near 100% accessible, and paratransit is a default system that we can like back up to. And I think that while some people will need paratransit, even if the system is fully accessible for a variety of reasons, it shouldn't be the default. And I don't think anybody wants it to be the default. And I think full integration is the way to go always, whether it be education, whether it be in the job market, or whether it be in transportation.
Speaking about future directions, what does the future hold for accessibility? So Abdul Rahim is asking, like, do you see autonomous vehicle as a stream to increase accessibility, and should we be advocating for faster implementation for that?
I think so. There's two questions there. Let me answer them in order. Future of accessibility, I would say uh, we need a fully accessible public transportation system, and we need to look at uh, car manufacturers to generate more accessible vehicles. Even if Uber wanted to create wheelchair accessible vehicles throughout North America, I don't know if we can, given the lack of actual number of cars that are available um, in the system. So that's an issue. Like there's just not enough cars coming out of Detroit or Tokyo to give us the accessible needs. Now AVs, I think we're facing a very similar problem in that as automated vehicles come out, is the form factor going to be the same? Is it going to be the same sedan where you have to get in, the way you get into cars today? Is it going to be an SUV where you have to climb in the SUV? Or are we going to make them actually accessible for everyone, where a wheelchair user can slide in there if you pull one of the seats out? And it's early still, but it's not that early anymore. And I think advocacy is growing around this, and there's a lot of advocacy to make sure that this doesn't go the wrong way. But uh, if AVs can be accessible, I think AVs can be a great way, depending on the cost of the system, to bring more accessibility for sure.
Shadi is asking about, I'm going back to COVID again. So he was asking about COVID, that many transit experts, like you as well, will be saying this is an opportunity to reinvent transit, or to rethink about how we are serving transit and how we are thinking about transit. We shouldn't be looking at ridership, we should be looking at how good the service is, all these things. How do you think transit need to be reinvented to be a better service for everyone, if you want to use the COVID as an opportunity?
Yeah, I think that So just generally speaking, like, is that, Ahmed, is that
That's
the
a
question? Like,
general
how do we,
that's a general one, not for people, right, not specifically for wheelchair accessibility, but this is a question for you as a transit expert, because you always wear
yeah,
two hats.
of course.
Sure,
And they intersect a lot too.
sure.
I think that, transit, having worked in a couple agencies now, um, some of them don't ask this question and some of them do, but there's a fundamental question I think that public transportation needs to ask itself, which is, why are we here? What is our purpose as a public transportation system? And the answer is not to run trains and buses, but rather, I believe the answer should be to connect people to social and economic opportunity. Now, then what is your answer to that question? How do I do that? Well, you intake tax dollars and fare revenue, and you output connectivity. And buses and trains are your tools, generally speaking, to get there. And that's probably going to be the case for 99% of your trips. Now, there are some trips, though, where I think that we need to actually look at new mobility, not just because I work at Uber, but I think I see this, especially in the paratransit space, that we've for 30 years have been relying on this model where as a transit agency, you hire a private broker. That broker contracts out with like 4 different public transportation companies that run van service, and then they cost $50 a trip, and boom, there you go. But why are we doing that now in the age of on-demand systems, and when paratransit is almost the ultimate on-demand system? That, I think we need to question that assumption and figure out what we're doing there. When it comes to fixed route service like buses and trains, uh, the number one reason why people leave the system, or one of the top reasons I should say, if you look at transit centers who's on board report, is unreliable service, or lack of frequency. And if we all know that frequency and reliability is what people care about with transit, why are we running 1 hour service to these places that uh, we expect people to ride the bus on? Like, you can't live your life around 1 hour service. There's got to be a better solution to that. And I think we've got to look into those kind of questions, and understand what is it that's going to be, bringing people back. Now, in the COVID world, this is going to be even tougher because of the lack of resources and the whole ridership pattern changing. People aren't going to downtown as much right now because of the office space. Will they be in the future? Hopefully. But I think once we understand the future state, we need to make sure we're aligned in that area to make it work.
Um, Speaking about funding a little bit, so you give us example from like which areas in geographically or politically you think that like you visited, or cities you have visited, that you felt that they're actually putting good funding there for universal accessibility. So we asked this question last week to Ron Bueling when he was talking about children with disabilities and their movement. And so he gave us his answer. So I want to hear your answer about where is the area you went and said, like, okay, that was a good one. I'm not suffering here. In your trips,
Yeah.
in your personal experience here. So now I'm putting
Uh,
your personal hat now.
by far and away, it's Singapore. Now, Singapore is obviously a special case as well, but I think people forget too. Singapore was like, and I looked at the history of the city when I was there. I mean, it was an undeveloped area, um, for better or for worse, in the 60s. And all of a sudden is becoming this, you know, economic powerhouse in the 90s and 2000s. And they have a subway system that's fully accessible, clean. I remember going there and there was actually an elevator out, which was like shocking. And the person who was, I didn't need it, I just happened to walk by it. But I asked the person about it, like, what happened here? And she profusely apologized and told me it would take a long time to get fixed. And I was like, oh my gosh, when are you expecting to come back? She's like, probably like 30 minutes. I was like,
Okay.
what? 30 minutes is a long time? To me, a long time is 4 days.
Sure.
30 minutes would be a blink of an eye. So that's the attitude they have in Singapore. It's like 30 minutes is a long time, and that to me was a symbol of how much they cared about making sure their system worked right. Um, Clearly, they're resourced differently than we are in the United States and North America, but resourcing is a reflection of your priorities, not the other way around. And so they've made a dedicated decision, or sorry, a conscious decision to make sure that their system is fully accessible, clean, and available. And I think that attitude goes a long way to making it what it is. I would love to see that kind of commitment here in North America for that kind of a level of accessibility. And again, it doesn't have to be today. Like it can be in 2030. Like let's set a goal. Let's get there and let's figure out what are the steps to make sure to get to that point.
So some of people will set the points in very long terms. So what are your thoughts about these? Because like one of the things that shocked me when I first moved to Montreal is the timeline they have to make all the stations accessible. It was like 2080 or something like that. So that was
Yeah.
like 13 years ago. And now they changed, but like at that time, so are we moving, because now right now it's like 2040, I think, or something. So we are moving into a better world now. We are trying to push that, but are we pushing it enough or not?
I don't think we're pushing it enough. I think you get to take this in the standing, and this gets into a lot of issues that are happening around the world today. So I'm just going to expand on that because it's part of this. But like, there is a question about patience, right? And if you look at the civil rights movement in the 60s in the United States, uh, MLK, I don't remember the exact quote, but MLK talked about patience and how you expect people to be patient when they're oppressed. Like, there's no room for patience if you're suffering every day from oppression. And I'm not saying that elevators are the same thing as being beaten by billy clubs and attacked by police dogs. It's not. But there is a certain level of oppression when you can't get to where you want to go or have an independent life because of circumstances beyond your control. And the fact that we as a society have said, oh, okay, 2080 is too long. How about 2040? Okay, most people that are alive in the 2000s might be dead by 2040, right? Or at least beyond their independent life at that point, or the peak of their lives. So I think when we make decisions like this, you have to understand what you're saying. That if you're saying, okay, we're going to make this accessible in 30 years, that's cool, but just understand you're telling people who are born 30 years ago that they will no longer be 30 years old, but they'll be 60 and retired, and the next generation will get the benefits. So can you live with that? Are you okay with that decision? Um, do we need more resourcing? How do we get it? What does it take then to get to 2030? And yes, there's going to be issues where we can't fight for 2025 because clearly there's other priorities in this world. That's totally fine. But at least let's put it on paper and say that we made that decision at 2030, 2040 for accessibility. And we're not just saying that because it's a convenient round number, but we're saying it because uh, we have other priorities that we think are more important. And again, let's make a conscious decision and say that rather than defaulting and costing a whole nother generation accessibility because we're too slow to move.
I wanted to unmute Misha Young, but I can't unmute him because he's
Yeah,
the
I'm here.
author. Yeah, you can. Misha, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. How you doing, Ahmed?
Yeah, how are you? So Misha, he's the author of the paper you referenced that you
Oh,
showed
awesome.
about Uber in Toronto. So he had a question. I thought of unmuting him so he can ask you the question directly.
Sure. Okay. So I had a question because that Toronto Municipal Code that you mentioned that has the travel time requirement for Uber Wave trips also requires them to charge similar prices for their Uber Wave, has to be in the same ballpark as non-Wave trips. Is that a viable business model for Uber, or do they need government to step in to make it a viable model?
Great question, Misha. First of all, thanks for the paper too. It was great to read what was going on there. So I think there needs to be something external to help make this work. Um, Whether it's government intervention, I think that's probably the easiest solution. But let me just outline what's going on there. So we charge the same price as Uber X for Uber Wave. The issue with Uber Wave versus X is that Wave costs us a lot of money, more than, and so it's not a profitable uh, product, if you will. And so what happens is if you can see this, if we're contracting out to someone like MB Transit, which is a contractor, and they're charging approximately X dollars per hour, we're not going to be able to make that most likely by charging the Uber X rates for Wave. And so possible solutions are still being explored, but one of them in California is trying to solve this issue. In California, all TNC trips, Uber, Lyft, whatever, are charged, I believe it's 10 cents extra per trip surcharge. And that money goes into a central fund in which then if you provide wheelchair accessible vehicle service to a certain performance standard, you are eligible to apply for some of that money back to you to help make up the cost. So I think that's one way potentially that can make waves more economically viable. Another way is paratransit partnerships, where paratransit trips can help pay the full cost of that wave, even though it is still cheaper for the agency, to help offset some of that cost. And potentially another way that we could look at doing this is, why is it only TNC trips that are paying the fee for this wave system, when if we think about the transportation system holistically, private cars are also, for the most part, inaccessible. And if we're looking at congestion pricing and other issues of externalities for private car use, as politically untenable as this is, but a gas tax increase or registration fee or something added on to private car use that can help subsidize on-demand waves could also be a viable option as well. I don't know the answer, Misha, but I know that generally speaking, the answer has to be some kind of external support in order to help make waves be more viable and drive down the wait times as well.
We have time for one last question, came from Samantha. So you gave us example of Singapore as the good place for wheelchair accessible. Do you have examples of older systems? So New York is an older system. So any other older system that you have used or you have seen that in North America or outside, even in Europe, that you felt that not as level of Singapore, but a little bit less?
Yeah,
but not as bad as Montreal and New York.
I would say it's the city that's in between Montreal and New York. I would say it's Boston. So if you look at Boston, so I went to school there 2004-ish, and it was not that great of a system. There was still a lack of elevators in many areas, and the ones that were there were breaking down constantly. I think they were at like a 94, 93% uptime. They got sued, and they settled the lawsuit. And it wasn't a money lawsuit, but a policy lawsuit. And they responded by contracting out their maintenance to a different company, to shooting for a better uptime, to building more elevators. And now if you go back to Boston, which I have done, it's fantastic. Their uptime is 99.7% now, which is unheard of for a public transportation system. They're just doing great. They maintained that for like 10 years. They're building elevators left and right. And so I would say Boston right now is the model North American city for going from terrible to great in a span of like less than 10 years. Not perfect, obviously, not Singapore, but it is a much more closer to home context in a system. It's Boston. It's not like it's a super rich city like San Francisco or New York, and it's a smaller city, but they've actually made the effort to do this. So I give a lot of credit to MBTA for getting where they are today.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for this talk and for being there with us today. We really appreciate having you.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for listening and asking great questions. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but really appreciate it. If you have a burning question, Ahmed knows how to reach me, and I'm sure you can send it my way.
Okay. Thanks. Bye, Chris.
All right. Bye, y'all.